Hi, my name's Angela Casey and welcome to Edinburgh Outdoors, the podcast that explores Edinburgh's green spaces and the people in them. I'm back this episode meeting up with Hetty Lancaster of Hetty's History Walks, a regular contributor to the podcast. And ever since I met Hetty, I've been nagging her to do a recording for us on Edinburgh's city walls, which are very ancient. They go back a long way and used to surround the old town. And today we are on the High Street and the Canongate, which are part of the Royal Mile. And we're dropping in and off the street because of traffic noise. So you'll hear the traffic coming and going as we go along. And I'm looking at some lovely old walls today with podcast regular Hetty Lancaster from Hetty's History Walks. So welcome again, Hetty.
Thank you very much for having me back.
It's very good to see you. And I know I've been nagging you to do this topic since we first met.
Yes, the Edinburgh city walls. So, and hopefully we've got quite a nice day as well. The sun has literally just shown its face, so hopefully getting a little bit warmer.
I hope so. It's very nice to be doing podcasts in the warmth, actually. It's really nice. But also very nice to be doing my hot topic.
Yeah, there's a lot in Edinburgh's Old Town that you can sort of explore. It's a great place for wandering around. It's one of those places that, I mean, Edinburgh generally, but it's one of those places where you can walk up and down the same street so many times, and it's only on your 30th go round that you notice something new. And I think Edinburgh is a city that's very much like that. I mean, I certainly find that when I'm wandering around, even having lived here for over 30 years. So today, hopefully, we're going to be looking at bits of the remaining city walls, talking about why the city walls were built, what their purpose was, and just giving a general idea, really, of why Edinburgh has them and how it affected the city. So we're, as you said, in the Old Town. We're near where the Netherbow Port was, which is it's about halfway down the Royal Mile, which runs between the castle and the palace. And so we're very close to it's basically like the crossroads where the High Street and the Canongate join with St Mary's Street and Geoffrey Street. Edinburgh was once a walled city, and access was controlled through gates, or ports, as we call them in Scotland. So we don't usually call them city gates, we generally would call them ports. Now the best known one today is the Netherbow Port. And nether meant lower, and bow meant like an arched gateway. This was complemented by the overbow, or the upper bow, and that was up near the castle on a street that we now know as the West Bow. Now, Edinburgh didn't get its first city wall until the borough was over 300 years old, but it is thought that these two bows probably existed right from the beginning, and that's because the borough was originally founded in 1128 to act as a regional market centre. These bows would have been reasonably simple structures, and they would have really marked the mercantile boundary of the borough. So they would have acted as checkpoints for controlling people and goods coming in, and they would also have provided a collection point for customs. So that was really important because this was the whole point of a borough, was to provide this regional market centre. You could tax people coming in, you could collect fees, and this is how the borough raised revenue. And you might ask, why were people coming into the borough to trade if they were being taxed?
Yeah.
Well, the benefit was that borough markets were very heavily regulated. So you had set weights and measures, and you had certain quality control on goods. So if you were buying your goods at a borough market, you could be sure that actually your pound of wheat was really a pound of wheat, and the quality of goods reached a certain standard. And there was somebody to complain to if you didn't think that was right. And so that's the benefit for people coming in to buy at the market. And the benefit for the borough is obviously to raise revenue.
So was the Cowgate where people brought the cows in?
So the Cowgate, the road of the Cowgate, so where you usually get the word gate in Edinburgh place names, street names, usually refers to G-A-I-T, as in the walk. So the Cowgate is actually the cow's walk.
So it wasn't where they brought the cows in.
Well, it kind of is, as in it's... So the Cowgate was the route that the cows would take out of the city to get to the meadows, the grassland, to feed during the day, and then they would come back into the city at night. So the Cowgate was... Yeah, so you could bring the cows in and
into
out.
The city.
Yeah, so Edinburgh used to have loads and loads of animals. I mean, Edinburgh's has virtually no animals. So people would have had livestock on their backlands. There would have been chickens and pigs wandering around the street. You would have had milking cows. There would have been loads of dogs, cats, obviously, things like that as well. Pigs and chickens would have been just wandering around in the high street. The high street was, it would have been covered with animal muck. But yeah, so the Cowgate was genuinely the road created, in fact, I think, so that the cows didn't have to use the high street, because you're trying to get the high street to be a bit cleaner, basically. So you're trying to get the animals away from the high street. But the gate word is the same as the cannon gate. So the cannon gate is not military cannons, it's religious cannons from Holyrood Abbey, which is at the bottom of the Royal Mile. And so it's really the priest's walk. It's the Canon's Gate. It's the way that the priests would walk to get up to the city or the borough of Edinburgh.
You're good at this. I learned so many things with you. It's brilliant.
Oh, good. Thank you. It means I'm doing my job right. So with the building of the city walls, the ports become even more important, because obviously the walls really restrict the physical access points in and out of the borough. Now, the Netherbow became the largest city port. It was a very grand two-storey gatehouse with a steeple and towers, and this was the one that was built at around 1600 and replaced an earlier structure. And in fact, if you stand just near the Scottish Storytelling Centre, you can actually see a plaque with the date 1606 on it, and that used to be in the original Netherbow port building.
It looks like an enormous structure. It's got the pictures of it. It's got these towers on the top.
Yeah, it does. So apparently, that one, the one that's in all the pictures, that was built around 1606, was replaced an earlier structure. The reason that it was being rebuilt was because James VI of Scotland had just become James I of England, and he was coming back to visit Edinburgh. And they basically went, oh my God, this Netherbow port, which is supposed to be the greatest gate into the city, looks really shabby and it's just not really very impressive looking. And so that was the new one that was built to really kind of create this really rather wonderful looking, impressive looking port. It is said to have been modelled on the old Port Saint-Denis in Paris, which also no longer looks like that. So there was a lot of influence from France, because Scotland at this period was in part of like the old alliance, and so which is why we actually use the word port instead of gate, because port is the French for door, and why we were looking towards France for architectural fashions and things like that. So the old alliance, I think it runs from approximately about 1290s to about the 1560s. But that's one of the reasons why there's quite a lot of French influence in Scottish culture at that particular period. So some of the words like Venel, for example, comes from the French. Port.
Oh, yeah. There's a picture of it on a wall, isn't there, in stone, which we've been hunting round the old town trying to find it, but it's somewhere. We are going to find it.
Well, hopefully we will find that later, because I know exactly the one you mean, and I can't for the life of me think exactly where it is.
I know, we will find it.
But it is around. But you can also, I'll give you a link so that people can follow the link and look at it on the Capital Collections website. So there are some lovely pictures of it in there. The actual structure itself was demolished in 1764, but the location of where it stood marked by these brass cobblestones. So if you're standing at the crossroads, you can look down and you can see these brass cobblestones, and that is basically marking the location of the Netherbow port originally.
And we walked past them just now, and that was the first time I'd spotted them. So I've crossed them many times and never realised they're there.
Well, it's quite funny, because you know how often I'm going, oh, you need to look up, keep looking up.
Yeah.
You also need to look down, because there's quite a lot of stuff on the ground as well. But obviously look where you're going.
Yeah, don't walk into the road without looking.
Now, on the other side of the Netherbow port, from the borough of Edinburgh, was the Cannon Gate, which from the 12th century until the 1860s was technically a separate borough from Edinburgh. And the Netherbow port is also why we get the word for the World's End. There's a pub just, you can see it at the crossroads, called the World's End Pub, and it is said that the name for that came because the unfree people of Edinburgh, so not the burgesses, not the freemen, they were called freemen because they didn't have to pay the toll to get in and out of the city gates. So the unfree, who aren't slaves, they're just like your ordinary people who are burgesses. You can get out of the city for free, but you have to pay to get back in. Now, because largely they can't afford to pay, effectively the Netherbow Port is the end of their world as they know it. They can't really leave the city.
Right.
So it's the end of their world.
Oh, I see. So it's the end of their world because they can't leave, because they can't afford to get back.
Can't afford, yeah, exactly.
So they're stuck in what is actually, when you look at the map, which we'll talk about, is actually a really tiny area.
That's what they say, yes.
With all those pigs and cows.
With all the pigs and cows. At least you had something to eat.
That's true.
So the best known of Edinburgh city walls is the Flodden Wall, and that's built in the 16th century, but there is also an earlier one. So before we go and have a look at this earlier wall, we're just going to walk up the Royal Mile a little bit and have a look at one other feature before we disappear off to go and look at the actual walls themselves.
And we'll do our best with the sounds because there is a lot of traffic, and because of the very high buildings and the cobbles, the cars are very noisy. So we've walked up the high street a bit, and we're now looking back down towards where the Netherbow would have been.
If we're standing here and we're looking down the Royal Mile, we can see John Knox House, which is sticking out on the left as we're looking at it. So John Knox House and its neighbour, Mowbray House, are the oldest buildings which remain on the high street today. So they date back to the 14th and 15th century, so they're very old. Now, the high street itself was laid out in the 12th century when the borough was being founded. It's actually very, very wide, so that there's lots of space to hold the markets. We always think of medieval towns to have really narrow, twisty streets, but actually the high streets are normally quite wide, so you have space for holding all the markets. And the Mercat crosses, or market crosses, would originally have been located right in the middle of the high streets so that your markets were happening around them. Because your Mercat cross is this symbol that your settlement holds borough status. So when we look down the Royal Mile towards John Knox House, what we can see is that John Knox House is quite unusual because it really sticks out into the high street, unlike all the other buildings. And so it's thought that the Netherbow Port was originally located more in line with John Knox House, and that's why it sticks out. So it's previously recorded in 1369 that the Netherbow Port actually stood to the west of St Mary's Wynd and Leith Wynd, which are what we now know as St Mary's Street and Jeffrey Street. And in fact, this location of having this port a little bit further up would actually fit, look at the line of the first known city wall, so the King's Wall or the Royal Wall, which is first mentioned in the 1420s. And that's what we can go and have a little look at now.
Yeah, let's go and do that. So we've come round to Tweedale Court, we've sneaked round to the back because it is actually a working court. And although these closes of the Royal Mile are beautiful historic places, people live and work in them, and we don't want to disturb them.
So we're standing in Tweedale Close. Now, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with Edinburgh, we should maybe explain what a close is. So essentially, it's a kind of access lane which leads from the high street to the land that was once behind the houses that lined the Royal Mile. So the closes were very carefully laid out along with the high street when the borough was founded back in the 12th century. So if you want to picture the layout of Edinburgh's old town, it is easiest to think of a fish skeleton or like a herringbone. And you can think of the castle as the head of the fish, down the high street and the Royal Mile forming the backbone, and then all the closes are coming off at right angles on each side, like the little bones of a fish. And so sometimes you call that a medieval herringbone street plan.
Oh, so it is something that exists, it's not just a poetic thought?
No, it's not just a poetic thought, so it's sometimes the way that you would describe it. So Edinburgh's Old Town very much has this medieval herringbone street plan, often contrasted to the New Town, which has a lovely grid plan. So Edinburgh once had almost 300 closes. About 80 or so, I think, remain. So obviously a lot of them have been lost due to development. Now in Tweedale Close, we've got a section of the old King's Wall, and you can see it running across here, and it only makes sense for it to be here if the Netherbow Port was located as being in line with John Knox House.
Oh yeah, because this actually, because we were at number 9, which is next to John Knox House, this actually would go straight up to where John Knox House is.
Yeah, so it makes perfect sense to think that actually the Netherbow port has moved a little bit and shifted over the years. I think they think that it was actually somewhere else slightly different as well. So it has moved around as the city's... I mean, the city's 900 years old, so, it's going to have moved around a bit. But I've got a map of the city walls, which we can have a look at. And again, I'll give you a link so that people can go and have a look online. So what we've got is one of the first walls that we get in the city is actually the castle ward wall, which dates from around 1335, and that really sort of surrounds the land that belongs to the immediate bit of the castle. So most of that would have long disappeared. And then we get bits of the first town wall, which I've marked in orange. So it comes off the earlier castle ward wall. So the earliest bits date from 1426, and that's a little section which today roughly follows the line of where Victoria Terrace is. I think bits of that still survive in some of the gardens between the Grassmarket and Johnston Terrace, and other bits are said to have been found inside later buildings such as Riddle's Court, which is thought to have been built into that early borough wall. And then there's another little section from 1427 which runs from roughly behind St Giles, where the Parliament Square now is, down to where South Bridge came in. So these two early walls were joined together when they were both extended following edicts by James II in 1450 and then another one by James III in 1472. And these edicts were basically to improve the borough's defences against incursions by the English.
So it's the English they were building these walls against.
Building these walls against, particularly. And so you can see that this King's Wall runs in this almost quite a straight line, but it doesn't enclose either the Grassmarket or the Cowgate. So one of the reasons that you can see very, very few bits is that the city has expanded, and these closes now go all the way down to the Cowgate. And we've then got the Flodden Wall, which is this lovely orangey yellow wall, and that's the most extensive, and it's built in the 16th century. It's the one that has nearly all of those ports in it. So there's 6. So we have the West Port, and by this point the Flodden Wall is enclosing the Grassmarket, so the West Port has superseded the Upper Bow or the West Bow. Then you would have had what we know as Bristow Port, but was also sometimes known as Greyfriars Port or Society Port. We've got Kirkerfield Port, which we know as Potter Row Port. We've got the Cowgate Port, the Netherbow Port there, and then there's another little one called the New Port, which is where the Flodden Wall came round to the north and joins up with the Nor Loch. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Flodden Wall shortly. And then lastly on the map we've also got the Telfer Wall, which you can see is built between 1628 and 1636. It's nice when you have a map that tells you all the dates so I don't have to remember them. So
that's just a little extension, the Telfer Wall then.
It is, and it was really built to enclose land that had been acquired by the borough after they'd built the Flodden Wall. And the land, some of that land was then given to the George Heriot's Trust, which is where they then built the George Heriot's School or hospital, which is what you see there now.
So this building in here now is alleged to be the old sedan chair garage, so like a taxi rank.
Essentially, yeah.
It's got some nice stonework on it.
It's got some lovely stonework.
Yeah.
The sedan chairs in Edinburgh were said to have some special design features. So because the closes in Edinburgh are so narrow, most sedan chairs normally had the doors out the side. So Edinburgh sedan chairs had the doors to the front, so that because you couldn't open the doors to the side because the closes are too narrow to get out, so you had to step out the front. Also, because our closes are very, very steep, and the seat was sometimes on a pivot, so that you stayed level. So there's one in the Museum of Edinburgh in the Canongate, and that definitely has a front opening door. It doesn't have a tilting seat, unfortunately.
So we're now leaving Tweeddale Court, where we've seen the King's Wall.
And we're going to go down to the Cowgate and then on to look at part of the remaining Flodden Wall.
So we might have a bit of traffic noise. We'll do our best, and if it's too noisy, we'll step off somewhere and talk as we go.
Yeah. So the Museum of Edinburgh is quite good because it's actually got some models of the city, what the city kind of looks like.
All right.
So we're just walking up. We can see bits of the remaining Flodden Wall.
With a pigeon sitting in the little alcoves.
Little holes in it. So these are really so that water can drain out, I think, because Edinburgh was generally quite wet.
And this is another thing that we walk past so often. and don't notice. But it's a huge piece of wall.
It is. It is a huge section of wall. So this is probably one of the best preserved bits. Again, this would have been rebuilt at different times. So we're looking at this big section of the Flodden Wall on the Pleasance. This would have run down the Pleasance to the Cowgate port, which would have sat across the Cowgate. And then, well, the wall technically would not have carried on up St Mary's Street, St Mary's Wynd. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as to why that wasn't the case. And here we can very much see how this is like a rough, rubble-built wall. There's not very much dressed stone. It is reasonably tall. And this is not all the original wall. The Flodden Wall is rebuilt a number of times.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Well, there's a load of brick there in the middle
so there's
of it
bits
at
of
one
brick
point.
there in the middle. You can see we've got different sections. Probably, you can see up here where there's a little gap. You can see on the inside, and that looks more like it's rubble infill, like smaller bits infilling. And so I think usually when they're building things like city walls or wide walls, is you have almost two walls very close to each other with the bigger stones, and then you infill the middle to create a nice thick wall which is capable of then standing up against attack. So we'll go around the corner into Drummond Street, and so here there's a section in Drummond Street, and you can clearly see different levels of stonework, and that is indicative of these different periods of rebuilding. I think this is the section that is redone in about the 1650s. So most of the stone came from local quarries, so places like Ravelston, and also places that were on the Borough Muir. The Borough Muir had lots of little quarries on it. So the Borough Muir is now underneath Bruntsfield Links and Marchmont and places like that. So you'd use this undressed stone. So undressed stone is just stone that's its natural shape. It's not really worked into a particular shape, which is why the older buildings in Scotland are all covered in that harling, that kind of render. And that's really to cover up the fact that you've got rough rubble stone walls underneath.
Right.
Makes it look a bit nicer, but also provides a really important weather coating. We'll go in and we'll see if we can find a slightly quieter bit to chat about the Flodden Wall.
We've now found a sunny section behind the old Surgeons' Hall on Drummond Street.
So the Flodden Wall was built after the Scots lost the Battle of Flodden against the English in Northumberland in the year 1513. So this was an absolutely disastrous defeat. It was one of the worst things that probably happened in Scotland's history. So King James IV was killed, along with many of the Scottish nobility, including 10 earls, 11 lords and over 50 other noblemen, along with around 10 to 12,000 ordinary soldiers. This was almost half the army that had gone south with King James. So it was devastating for Scotland because King James IV's son, King James V, was just 17 months old. So obviously once you get a minority king like that, rule is basically taken over by a whole series of regents, and this creates lots of power plays going on as different families vie to be the regent and vie to be the one who's got the most influence over the king. So it's quite a kind of like tumultuous bit. The thing that is dumb about it is we weren't even at war with England at the time. So the Scots invaded England as part of the Old Alliance. So the Old Alliance was basically this agreement between France and Scotland that was in place between about the 1290s to about the 1560s against their common enemy of England. So the idea was that if England attacked one of them, the other one would then attack England to create a diversion. In 1513, King Henry VIII of England had troops in France fighting the French King Louis XII, and so James IV of Scotland saw himself as honour bound to declare war on England. So it was a very noble idea, but was ruinously disastrous for Scotland politically.
I don't know what the population was at the time, but that number of people to die is
It's a
huge
huge
number.
amount. I guess it's probably difficult to know exactly how many people died, but it would definitely have been in the thousands rather than the hundreds. It was a huge defeat. So with the Scots' defeat at Flodden, obviously Edinburgh, not that far from Northumberland, really, in the grand scheme of things. And so Edinburgh was expecting an English invasion, and so they began to build this defensive wall to protect particularly the southern and eastern flanks of the borough. The western flank was already protected by the castle, and the northern flank by the Nor Loch.
The Nor Loch is where Prince's Street Gardens is now, and the railway station,
Yes,
and all of that.
absolutely, yes. But interestingly, originally the Nor Loch wasn't a natural loch that was actually created by damming a burn or a stream in the 15th century, and it was purposefully flooded to create a defensive loch to protect the northern flank of Edinburgh. Now, obviously, building this wall was a massive task, especially given that Edinburgh had lost many men in battle, but the council did use some quite clever tactics to help. Technically, no wall was actually built along the eastern flank, and so instead they used the walls of the houses in St Mary's Wynd and Leith Wynd that were either side of the Netherbow Port. So there's not actually any, but apart from that little section of the Flodden Wall that runs down the Pleasance, that's the only section that was actually built facing east. The rest of it was really the backs of the houses either side of the Netherbow Port.
What if you had a window looking out?
You would have had very small windows, and you could have blocked them up as well. Generally, in medieval cities, they were quite insular looking. So this idea that you want to look out at the lovely wild natural landscape is a very modern idea. So really, if you had a house in the city wall or on the outskirts of the city, it would have faced in towards the city. So additionally, along the southern flank, the Borough Council decided to enclose many of the religious houses within the new wall. So if we look at our map again, we can see that the Flodden Wall is now enclosing the grass market, and actually comes quite a long way away from the Cowgate and encloses quite a lot of land. And although this made the wall longer, it meant that they could utilise existing walls around some of the many religious orders that were in Edinburgh at the time. So where we're sitting was actually originally in the lands of the Dominican Priory, the Blackfriars. It's called the Blackfriars because they wore black robes, so they're the Blackfriars. The Dominican Priory was here, and that would have been originally walled. And then further up, they would have used the walls around the St Mary's Collegiate Church at the Kirk of Field, which is where the University Quadrangle is. They also used the walls around the Friary of Franciscans, which is Greyfriars, again because they wore grey robes.
I'm beginning to realise where all these names came from that I didn't know.
We're very uninventive. The street names in Edinburgh, if I'm honest, it's either descriptive or it's after people. And then they also used a building that most of us never heard of, including myself, which was the Maison Dieu, or the Poorhouse, and this was actually very close to the Grassmarket end of the Cowgate, which was connected with the Magdalen Chapel, which is still there. And so they utilised all these walls that already existed in order to provide a base for the city, funded through the town council ostensibly. So maintaining the town's defences was actually the responsibility of the burgesses, but they controlled the town council, who basically introduced a levy onto the citizens, which Edinburgh citizens then had to pay. So I guess it's a bit like council tax, except we're not having to go do the work. The building of the Flodden Wall was incredibly slow and very piecemeal. Much of it was destroyed when the borough was attacked as part of Henry VIII's rough wooing in 1544.
All right, so there was a bit of retaliation when they came back and had a go at Edinburgh.
Yeah, because the rough wooing, he wants to marry the very young Mary Queen of Scots to his son Edward, and the Scots aren't at all keen on this at the time, and so very much resist it. And this is part of Henry's going, right, well, I'll beat them into accepting. And so this is sometimes called the rough wooing.
It's a really good phrase.
Which is good, yes. I do love the sense of humour that comes along with some of these things. So that was 1544, the Earl of Hereford basically leads an attack, and pretty much it says that Edinburgh's burnt to the ground. I'm not quite sure that this is quite true, but certainly a lot of the buildings would have been destroyed. Rebuilding began again in the late 1550s. This was a very tumultuous period. This is when you get the Protestant Reformation clashing with the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. Taxes are again levied to raise funds. Lots of acts are passed to repair the wall, to make it like a legal obligation to do these things. But it wasn't just about defence, to be honest. Having the wall did actually influence Edinburgh in other ways in the way that it was used. It allowed the borough to have a customs barrier which deterred smuggling. So by forcing people to come in and out of the ports, you can protect illegal goods and black market goods from coming in, which is really important as a market trading centre. It also allowed the borough to impose curfews, which meant that you could keep law and order. So the gates were generally shut at 8 o'clock at night. And you also had a night watch who would basically patrol the streets to make sure that people weren't being disorderly, but also to keep out for surprise attacks as well. So it's a little bit of both. And of course, controlling the movement of people also meant that you could prevent things like the spread of plague. So you could close the city gates and help to protect the populace from plague. You could also close them so you could keep out beggars. You know, there's various different points where we have dreadful famines and people flock to the boroughs to try and find food, and boroughs essentially are trying to shut them out.
So if people are looking to go and see bits of the wall, obviously Drummond Street, the Pleasance, is a great place to see the corner of the Flodden Wall, and also around Heriot's and going up towards the Vennel. You've got great bits there, and Tweedale Court, where we've just found the alleged bit of the King's Wall. And I know you can trace it in Forest Road. There's a tiny bit of it visible.
And you can also trace, there's the lines are also marked at the end of the Grassmarket as well, coming down from Granny Green steps and up the Vennel. So there's marks on the floor about the line of the old wall there. So if people want to walk the line of the city walls, it might be worth looking up the Edinburgh Riding of the Marches, and then that is available and open to the public, that they can do that.
The other place, actually, that I saw where you could see quite a lot of the Flodden Wall is in Greyfriars Kirkyard.
Yes, there's sections in Greyfriars Kirkyard. There is also, I discovered, bits within the National Museum of Scotland, which was built over the top. Unfortunately, they're not in public areas, so they're actually more in like the basement areas that aren't open to the public.
So you can't go and see it.
So you can't actually go and see it. But I did see there was some people put photographs up when they did some writing about it.
So if people want to find out more, I mean, I suppose the best question I should ask is, where do you do your research when you're doing this?
Books that I've got in my rather extensive library. My library keeps growing because I can't resist buying books. So I just look up books which might have little bits here and there. And I also looked up the book of the Old Edinburgh Club. So they've just done a lot of digitisation of some of the old books. So the books are full of scholarly articles that is published once a year from 1908 until now. And they are just full of loads of scholarly articles about various different things in Edinburgh. You can find them online at the website of the Old Edinburgh Club. There's a whole section on resources. There's lots of PDFs that you can download and read about all sorts of things about Edinburgh history.
Have you been anywhere interesting recently?
I haven't been anywhere new recently. I did do a really lovely walk around Arthur's Seat a couple of weeks ago with those where we had some first sunny days of spring, and that was really nice because I hadn't actually been out for a good long walk for ages.
Well, we had a lot of traffic at the beginning of the chat in a very busy high street, and saw some of the old buildings, and that was great. And now we've finished up sitting in this lovely square, which is part of Edinburgh Uni. And I don't know what that big tree is, but it's going to be beautiful, I think, when it comes out. And so, yeah, as always, Hetty, thank you very much. Particularly because I know you've had to research some of that, because I demanded that we talked about the city walls.
I did have to gen up a little bit.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, because it's been fascinating and I've loved it, and I can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, none at all. It's been my absolute pleasure. It's always a lot of fun doing these.
So anyway, thank you very much. I'll see you again.
Much.
Well, I really enjoyed that podcast, chatting to Hetty, who I always get on really well with, and learning more about the city walls. And I have put links on the blurb of the podcast that allows you to find out where you can go and see bits of the walls. It's worth seeking them out and finding out more about it, because it's a fascinating piece of history. And if you enjoyed the podcast and you've enjoyed listening generally to Edinburgh Outdoors, please go online, rate us and write a review. And don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues about it too. And if you know of an outdoor space in or around Edinburgh that might like to be featured, please get in touch.